Hi, everyone. This is Aaron Larson, executive editor of Power Magazine, and you're listening to the Power Podcast. On today's episode, I'm joined by Jim Matheson. Jim is the CEO of the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association. Thank you for coming on the program, Jim, and please tell a little bit about yourself and your organization.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, first of all. Again, Jim Matheson. I've been the CEO of the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association for coming up on 10 years this summer. This is the national service organization that represents roughly 900 electric cooperatives that are in 48 different states. We serve about 54% of all the land mass in this country, those utilities do. And we also serve in many ways the most difficult, hardest to serve areas in the country, areas with sparse population, tough terrain. And electric cooperatives do this because, decades ago when FDR tried to electrify rural America, no one else would do it. So the people living in those areas formed their own cooperatives owned by the members in the community. And here we are 80, 90 years later, and these cooperatives are significant electric utility operations throughout rural America serving 42 million people. And as the National Association, we perform a lot of functions on behalf of our members. Obviously, front and center, one is advocacy in terms of advocating for good public policy for our members.
Well, I have a fond appreciation of the rural electric cooperatives because I grew up on a farm out in rural Minnesota, and unfortunately, my family's farm was on the investor-owned utility side of the road, while other farms across the street were on a rural electric cooperative. And it was always a frustration of my dad's because our power prices were always higher than theirs, and he constantly complained about it. So what can you say about rural electric cooperatives that maybe people don't know right off the bat?
Well, I think it's important to know that it's a different business model. It's non for profit, it's actually owned and governed by the consumers they serve. So the consumers all own the utility and they elect the board of directors that provides governance and direction to the organization. So it's 100% consumer driven in terms of how the utility is run, the strategies they pursue, the operations they deploy. It's all in the name of the consumer. So as you might imagine, reliability of electricity supply and affordability of electricity supply are just core to the mission of every electric cooperative in the country. And I want to underscore the affordability because the country's rural electric cooperatives serve 92% of all of the persistent poverty counties in the United States of America. So when we talk about affordability, we really mean it because people that are served by co-ops, there's a bunch of them that it's a stretch to pay the bill every month. So we want to make sure we're as lean as we can be and be responsible in providing electricity.
And I know rural electric cooperatives are facing some of the same challenges that other utilities around the country are. And one of the biggest ones is data centers and how AI data centers are affecting the load supply. What are you hearing from members, and how is this load growth affecting them?
Well, it's interesting. After decades of relatively flat growth across the country, across all types of utilities for electricity demand in this country, suddenly we're seeing this increase in demand. And it actually started a few years ago, and it started with other types of loads like more electric heat pumps, more electrification of the economy with electric vehicles, onshoring of manufacturing. So we saw the trends start to go up in terms of increased demand. And then, of course, data centers, and particularly those that are there to serve artificial intelligence, use significant quantities of electricity. So we've really seen this boom in projected demand in this country. And it's a challenge for all utilities, not just rural electric cooperatives, in terms of how do we meet this growing demand in a responsible way? Number one, how do we just get the infrastructure built in time to meet the demand? Because, gosh, the electric business is one where it's a capital intensive business. Every investment in a power plant or a major transmission line is years in the planning stage, unfortunately years in the permitting stage, and takes time to build. So the electric sector is under the gun right now in terms of meeting this increased demand. But part and parcel of that, a concern that we've been raising is at the same time this demand is going up, we've had various public policy objectives in the last few years in this country that have shut down existing power plants before the end of their useful life. So the whole supply demand equation is being affected on both sides of that equation. And we've been really concerned about the fact that we should not be shutting down viable power plants before an appropriate replacement has been identified and put into place to meet that power need.
And that was gonna be my next question is how has the generation portfolio been evolving for co-ops? Are you finding that, coal plants are under pressure, or are they excited to kind of extend these lives now as the demand has increased?
Well, it's interesting. Every local situation has its own circumstances that dictate which type of fuel source may be more or less viable, and every utility likes to have a mix in their portfolio of different types of generation. But in many respects, not just unique to co-ops, but the whole electric sector, coal plants have shut down a lot in this country for two reasons. One is public policies encourage the shutdown, and in other cases, is because natural gas has been so inexpensive over the last 10, 15 years that the economic choice has been to shift from coal to gas as well. But the important feature I like to highlight is not necessarily the specific fuel as much as is it a type of fuel source that allows for always available generation, or is it intermittent generation? And what I mean by that is coal, gas, nuclear power is always available. Renewables like solar and wind are intermittent. They're not always available. That doesn't mean renewables have no value, but they need to be part of a portfolio. They can't do it on their own. You've got to have a capacity to meet the needs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And so electric cooperatives are in favor of having the flexibility to make the decisions that make sense for them in terms of their existing portfolio of electric generation. What are the reasonable and most responsible additions to that portfolio? We don't like mandates that say you have to use this or you can't use that. And like I said, across the country, you'll see very different fuel mixes. My gosh, the obvious example is up in the Pacific Northwest, they rely so much on hydroelectric. In Texas, it's natural gas. We have co-ops in Georgia and Pennsylvania that rely a lot on nuclear power. There's a mix across the country that makes sense for those specific locations. And so, one of the central tenets of advocacy that our national association does on behalf of all of our members is to maintain that flexibility and not have a federal one size fits all approach to electric generation.
And you mentioned nuclear and that some co-ops do already have nuclear in their portfolio. Do you see small modular reactors being kind of an important possible game changer for co-ops because they're smaller and perhaps less expensive, less costly, hopefully if things work out as expected. Where do you see those fitting in?
Well, I think that in the long run, however you want to define the long run, I think nuclear power is going to have to continue to be a source that's added to our generation mix as a country, and including electric cooperatives. Now, whether the small modular reactors, which everyone says, oh, we're a few years away from them being ready, we've been saying that for 20 years. So whether they come to fruition where they are a more economical and less expensive option than the large nuclear power plants we build in this country, I think that remains to be seen. And I hope both options become less expensive as we move forward. But I do think that when it comes to nuclear energy, where it makes sense, electric co-ops have invested in the past. And incidentally, we've got two electric cooperatives, one in Michigan and one in Indiana, that collectively are taking all of the power from a nuclear power plant that had been shut down in the state of Michigan, and they're going to start it up again. It's a third party firm that's going to operate that power plant, but two electric cooperatives signed a power purchase contract to take the full output of that nuclear plant just for these two utilities. So, yeah, when it makes sense, we clearly value that always available generation that nuclear power can provide. And if the small modular technology evolves in a way where it's economic, there's no question that that's going to be an important part of the fuel mix in the future.
And you've said that, renewables are also a part of that all of the above type strategy. And a lot of times we're seeing energy storage thrown in there. Where do you feel energy storage fits and how could that be an economic possibility for some of these smaller co-ops?
Well, I think energy storage in terms of batteries, that's what basically what we're talking about. Under current technology, which is roughly, let's say you get 4 hours out of batteries, just that's kind of a rule of thumb out there. That's not necessarily a new generation source. It is a valuable tool in terms of managing load and shifting load on a daily basis between when you have some off peak and you can power up the batteries again. But it's certainly not a replacement for an always available power plant that can run 24/7 because the batteries just don't hold the charge that long. So they are a valuable tool in terms of managing load. Electric cooperatives are already using storage in certain circumstances because it is valuable in terms of their resource mix. The technology development that would definitely enhance the value of storage is if we can have longer duration storage of batteries. If you could have battery installations that could store 100 hours of electricity, that's a game changer. That would be significant. And lots of folks have been trying to solve for that problem over the years. But in the current state of technology today, storage is a nice load management tool, but not necessarily a replacement for a generation, if that makes sense.
A lot of cooperatives have limited budgets and they do a great job managing those budgets because, they have to. But with inflation and supply chain constraints that we're seeing, which are causing costs to, in some cases, double for new equipment, and we're finding shortages and long wait times, how is that affecting your members? And is it harder for them to adjust?
Well, first of all, you have definitely correctly described the current environment. There are upward price pressures across all components of what you invest in electric system, from big items like big new natural gas turbines that generate electricity, all the way down to a pole or a crossbar or the meter you put next to someone's house. Everything is seeing upward price pressure. The electricity supply chain is under pressure, quite frankly. First of all, it's a global supply chain in many respects, so tariffs matter. And secondly, to the extent that historically we've had flat demand in this country for so long, and suddenly we see this huge growth, that affects all aspects of the electric system, all not just the big power plants and big high voltage transmission lines. I know those are the things that are the big dollar items and get the big headlines, but everything is getting more expensive. And so those upward price pressures are not unique to electric cooperatives. The whole electric sector faces that. You ask, because of the cooperative model, how does that affect us? Well, in a couple of ways. Number one, we are owned by the consumers we serve. We're not like the investor owned, which also have shareholder return issues where money goes to shareholders on Wall Street. It's 100% affects the consumer for us. So we make investments not to build rate base, not under considerations how it affects different variables. There's only one variable, and that is how it affects the consumer's bill. And we have to invest responsibly because it's important for us to have reliable power. And we have to invest responsibly in terms of finding the most cost effective means to meet that need and not present undue costs on our members. But because we're the cooperative model, I don't think it puts us in a disadvantaged position compared to others. We go to the capital markets, we borrow money, we fund our projects with debt. We don't go to the stock market and fund it by issuing new stock as well. That's one distinction. But the capital markets recognize the stability and the creditworthiness of electric cooperatives. I have heard no indication of any shortage of access to capital for electric cooperatives. However, when this material, as you said in your question, when all these costs are going up, it has upward pressure on ultimately the rate that the consumer pays, and we and everyone in the electric sector is looking for all the best ways we can to hold the line on that. And yet it's easier said than done. But there's no question electric co-ops, as I said, 100% consumer owned, governed by consumers. So it's top of mind every day. It's in the DNA of an electric co-op.
And as the leader of the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, what are your top priorities for the year on whether that's with Congress or at the
Sure,
Federal Energy
sure.
Regulation Commission? What are your main priorities?
They're all centered. You won't be surprised around the notion of how do we maintain reliability and how do we maintain affordability. And when it comes to reliability, we want to be able to move quickly to build new assets. That means number one, we got to eliminate or modify onerous regulations that exist primarily at the EPA. And we are making progress on that with this current administration to do just that. We want to be able to move quickly to maintain our assets and not have to shut them down before the end of their useful life. And there's been a regulatory agenda that has actually been forcing the shutdown of a lot of power plants. We need to stop that now. It's the old cliche, when you find yourself in a hole, the first step is to stop digging deeper. And we need to, as a country, we need to stop doing that. Number two, we need the ability to build things in a more timely way. And the permitting and siting process in this country has lost its way. It's very difficult, not just in the electric sector. It's difficult for anyone to build any major infrastructure project in a timely way. And that's in a lot of ways, that's a federal issue that NRECA works on, but there's also state and local permitting and siting issues that also have to be addressed. So there's not one quick fix or one bill that can go through Congress to fix that. It's multiple layers of government and multiple statutes on the books, like the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, Historic Preservation Act, National Environmental Policy Act, just to name four quick ones on the federal side. That being said, I see real consensus in Congress in a bipartisan way to do something about permitting reform, and that hasn't been the case in the past. And so permitting reform to allow us to move in a more predictable, timely way on moving ahead with new investments, that would be a priority for us. Another priority is to make sure that the United States Department of Agriculture, which historically has been where electric cooperatives go for financing through something called the Rural Utility Service, and this goes back to the days of FDR creating rural electrification in the first place. This is a remarkable asset for the taxpayer. It's like an infrastructure financing bank that makes the taxpayer money. And historically, it's done just that because our default rate is practically zero on our loans. And so we want to make sure that borrowing authority, USDA, Congress has to increase that amount. And as we just discussed, where costs are going up for these investments in the electric sector so much, there's a cap on how much USDA can lend each year. We need to increase that cap because the need is out there, the costs are going up, and it's the most economic way for electric cooperatives to make their investments. As I said, at the end of the day, it makes money for the U.S. Treasury, so it's a win-win. And finally, if I was to list one more, it would really be about how we can reform and make the FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Administration, work better for electric cooperatives. It's an interesting relationship that exists between electric co-ops and FEMA due to something in Congress called the Stafford Act. Because we're non-for-profit utilities, Congress made the decision that FEMA should help pay for recovery efforts from natural disasters. And that applies to all the country because it's not just hurricanes, which kind of get the big press when they happen. It's ice storms, it's windstorms, it's derechos, it's wildfires, it's flooding. It happens in every state in the country. And while the relationship between FEMA and electric co-ops has always been a critical relationship, it can work better. And we've got legislation in Congress to reform FEMA, make it more accountable, make it more predictable. That would be another important legislative priority for electric cooperatives in 2026.
You've talked about so many different things already, but what are some of the biggest challenges that you see rural electric cooperatives facing today, and what isn't getting enough attention from policymakers or the broader industry?
Well, I'll give you one that's half that question and not the other. I think the whole issue with these huge, large loads, these data centers are getting bigger and bigger in terms of total power demand. And it's not like normal growth where it's incremental over time. It's like one step function where it's a huge amount of power coming in a system all at once. And everyone's aware of it now. We all know AI is creating this data demand, but I'm not sure policymakers and everyone know all of the complex details that have to be addressed to make sure this happens in an appropriate way. And what do I mean by appropriate way? I mean, we want data centers to pay their fair share. We don't want existing consumers to have their rates go up because this new load comes on. There is a way to do this. You can negotiate a contractual relationship between the utility and the data center that can work in more of a win-win scenario, but it's very complicated. Every local situation is different. We can't have one federal rule for data centers that's one size fits all across the country. But as electric cooperatives, we're prepared to have conversations with data centers, and in some places it's going to make sense, and we can have a deal that comes to a yes. And in other places, it's going to come to a point where there isn't a deal, and the answer is going to be no. But I think that the data center issue, it's funny. At the one level, everyone knows it, but they kind of know just the surface, and they don't know all the factors underneath it that have to be addressed to make sure we have an appropriate rollout of that in terms of being part of our economy, which a lot of people want to have happen because we're in this race with China for who's going to dominate artificial intelligence in the world. And a lot in the political world, everyone wants the U.S. to build lots of AI data centers here, so it's based here in the United States. I understand that goal, but the details for how you make that work in a fair and equitable way. That's the complexity that I think we need to have more discussion and more awareness across the policy world.
And I know listeners have probably learned more about electric cooperatives in the past 20 minutes than they knew prior to this. But what do you wish the broader power industry understood better about rural electric cooperatives?
Well, stating the obvious that I work for the National Association, I probably have my bias, but I think the electric cooperative model is a great way to provide electrical service to consumers because it's 100% consumer focused in terms of how it makes all of its decisions. And I think the public policymakers appreciate that. I'll talk to members of Congress who are from congressional districts that don't have electric cooperatives, and I say, look, I'm not here to criticize the other utilities that are out there. But to the extent that all of your constituents are also consumers, while you should know your local utility and that's an investor owned, you should also pay attention to what we say because all of your consumers, all of your constituents are consumers as well, and that consumer perspective relates to everyone in this country. And so that would be something that I hope everyone understands is that we're happy to offer our thoughts about what we think is good policy to anybody. And we do. We work on Capitol Hill talking to all 435 congressional offices in the House of Representatives, and a lot of them don't represent co ops. That's okay. They have the same vote as anyone else, and they have a consumer interest like everybody else. And I think that's what's really neat about the cooperative movement.
Well, Jim, this has been a really interesting discussion. I've appreciated having you on the show. Is there anything that I haven't asked you about that you think would be important to mention before we wrap up?
Listen, I think you've hit all the key issues, and I know that your focus is on energy and power, but I just one interesting thing that the electric cooperative movement is involved in as well is bringing broadband to these rural areas that are underserved. It's the same thing as in the 1930s with electricity. Here we are again, where these sparsely populated areas don't have access. The for-profit companies, it doesn't make sense for them to do it, and we have roughly 200 of our members across the country are now in the broadband business. And by the way, you do invest in a fiber optic backbone for your electric system anyway. So we're well positioned to turn that into retail broadband for consumers in the service territory as well. So that's probably something your listeners didn't know. And I just think it's an indication of the community ownership and community focus of electric cooperatives that they see this need. The broadband business is different from the electric business, but we have a capacity to bring that to consumers. And so I'm really proud of that the electric cooperatives have stepped up to meet that community need and do it in a responsible way.
Well, that's great to hear. And again, for listeners, I've been speaking with Jim Matheson, CEO of the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association. And Jim, thank you so much for your time.
Okay, really appreciate it. Thanks so much.